Welcome to this edition. It's a special edition of Discussions with Ian Trottier. I am your host, Ian, and today we've got the doubleheader lined up for you. As last week, Happy Thanksgiving. We did not broadcast, so I'm coming in a little bit earlier today to bring in our doubleheader guest. He's not doubleheaded. At the 5 o'clock hour, the 5:15 mark, we will be joined today by Preeti Casaretti. And Preeti is a former Goldman Sachs financial analyst, and after that, she was with Andreessen Horowitz, Menlo Park venture capital firm, and she is now a blockchain engineer. So we will be discussing the blockchain with Preeti at the 5 o'clock hour. That's the normal slot. Ken Caldeira will be joining us shortly in about, 90 to 120 seconds, just a couple minutes here. Quickly on Ken, we'll be discussing climate change with Ken. He is a leading scientist in the field in regard. He's received his PhD from NYU in atmospheric sciences. He's an expert on Earth system science at Stanford University, where I believe he's a fellow currently. He's also a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institution, Department of Global Ecology. Ken investigates issues related to climate, carbon, energy systems. We have problems in our weather. Climate change is real, so he's going to help us understand it a little bit better. He studies the global carbon cycle, marine biogeochemistry, and chemical oceanography. He's a lead author of the State of the Carbon Cycle Report, as requested by the U.S. Congress. He's appeared on Fox, PBS, and in the New York Times, and has been published in the American Journal of Science, Environmental Science, and Technology, and, for instance, the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. He'll be discussing climate change with us and what he knows about it, and how we can help Mother Nature possibly reverse course. We're going to learn more about what he knows and how he can help us understand this better. And I will then cut to a break, and at the 5 o'clock hour, go live with Preeti Casaretti. So tweet me, Instagram me, follow me. You're on WynwoodRadio. I'll be back shortly with Mr. Ken Caldeira. Thanks for tuning in. This is Discussions with Ian Trottier. Okay, I am back. Thanks for tuning in to Discussions with Ian Trottier. You're on WynwoodRadio out of the District of Wynwood in Miami. And today's guest, as mentioned previously, is Mr. Ken Caldeira. Ken, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Good, fantastic. So Ken, you're in California currently? Are you in California?
Yes, I'm on the Stanford University campus.
Fantastic. How's the weather?
It is gorgeous outside, as it often is in this vicinity.
Yes, and you just took your sweater off, so it's warm.
Yeah, well, yes, we have a green building here that uses very little energy, but sometimes the temperature control is a little less precise than one might want. So my office tends to get
chilly,
warm when I close my door. No, it tends to get warm when I close my door.
Okay.
Which I'm doing to avoid noise for this podcast or this transmission.
Yes, thank you. So Ken, you have an incredible resume, and for listeners out there who didn't catch the intro, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you've got studies, a degree, a PhD in atmospheric sciences from NYU. Maybe judging by your accent, perhaps it sounds like you are maybe from the East Coast. As you know, I don't know if you know, but I'm currently broadcasting out of Florida. You're a current fellow at Stanford in Earth System Sciences, and you also work with the Carnegie Institute, Department of Global Ecology. Apart from all of that, and correct me if I'm wrong in any of that, but apart from that, you've also prepared something very important for U.S. Congress, and that would be the State of the Carbon Cycle Report. Is all of that correct?
That's all correct. I was born in New York City and grew up mostly in the New York suburbs area. And I've participated in many different reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the U.S. government and so on. So National Academy, Royal Society. So that means I've sat in a lot of rooms arguing about nonsense.
Well, nonsense, but the bottom line would be that to hear it from you, Ken, climate change is happening. Can you confer that we have do we have a problem?
Yes, the best evidence suggests that that nearly all or most of the warming that's occurred on the planet over the last half century can be attributed to human activities. And with continued greenhouse gas emissions, that warming can be expected to continue. And so if you look at any kind of temperature record, global temperature record, you see it's going up, and humans are largely to blame. And the big question really is, what will it mean for human societies and natural ecosystems? It's the physics of the climate system are relatively well understood, but how humans and natural things will respond to that climate change is more speculative.
So I've got a pressing question, and this is pressing because it's something that I haven't been able to answer here for a while, and I wanted to get your opinion if you have one at all. But so the question is this: if we look back at the current world population, let's say it's around 7 billion right now. If we go back to, let's say, the 1850s, give or take 150 years, we have seen a dramatic spike in world population. Does that coincide at all? And my numbers may be off because it seems like the combustible engine might be right around that 1900 mark. I don't know exactly when that was introduced, but is there any correlation between CO2 emission, carbon monoxide, the effects of fossil fuels from gasoline burning, combustible engine, with an increase in drastic, in world population? Does that make sense to you? Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, there are complicated two-way relationships. First of all, for any kind of pollution, if there are twice as many people, other things equal, there'll be twice as much pollution. And so the number of people on the planet is a multiplier in front of whatever the per capita pollution rates are. But another factor, and perhaps bigger factor, is industrialization. As today, for example, the top 10% richest people in the world are responsible for about half of all emissions, whereas the 10% poorest people in the world are only responsible for about 1% of the emissions. And so industrialization and just getting more wealthy and consuming more is another big point. And then I guess the other point is going the other way, that all this wealth generation has allowed us to have better health care, maybe not equitably distributed, but better health care that's led to lower infant mortality rates and increasing population. And so there are feedbacks between economic growth and population growth. Oops, sorry.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. So then let me then go into something called the carbon taxing, and that whole concept of trying to tax. So if the 10%, the majority of the burden is on those shoulders, and are they not? It seems like they're not doing enough to curb the pollution. I don't know, but it seems like there is a problem. So let's take the notion and concept of carbon taxing. Is what do you think of that? Is that helping chip away?
Carbon taxes are a favorite mechanism for reducing emissions, a favorite many economists. Of why we were in a project with the New York State Energy Research and Development Administration. I might have that name slightly wrong. And they are evaluating on how good different energy technologies would be in helping with climate change. But that's an extremely difficult thing to do, because if there's a better battery, to say, well, what is that battery going to do to emissions, and how's that going to propagate?
All right, so we've lost Ken. Let me pause. Let me try to bring him back in here. Ken, have I got you? Try to reconnect with Ken. Thanks for your patience. All right, let me try him again. Thanks for your patience, guys.
Hi.
Hey, Ken.
Hopefully this will work a bit better. Okay. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Are we patched through?
We're good, yeah.
Okay, so I forget it was now that that economists tend to like a carbon because it sends a clear market signal and allows companies to make decisions, and it's economically efficient. And the basic idea is that for each pound or ton or whatever of carbon dioxide released to the atmosphere, there would be some fee, and that different economists disagree about what should be done with the revenues that a tax generates, but it could be distributed equally to all taxpayers, or it could be used to reduce the deficit or other taxes or who knows what. Mm-hmm. But the advantage of a carbon tax is that let's say when somebody pulled oil out of the ground or mined coal, that they would pay a tax when they mined that, and then that would tend to make fossil fuels more expensive than wind or solar or other less polluting technologies, and then allow market forces to decide which technologies would be the best to provide low carbon renewable power. And so economists tend to like it because economists like things that avoid politicians deciding on technological winners and losers, and most economists prefer that market forces make those decisions.
Now, what are your thoughts on, you're in the Bay Area, so Tesla, I believe, used to be or is in Fremont. I think it occupies an old Ford plant, if I'm not mistaken. What are your thoughts on that movement, electrical cars?
Again, I'm pretty technologically neutral, and like anything that works. Around here, Tesla has been extraordinarily popular in that it's a kind of status symbol to be driving around in a Tesla. Mm-hmm. And, as we saw in Germany with their rooftop solar photovoltaics, that the more of something you build, the more you learn how to do it, and that tends to drive down costs. And so Teslas are pretty expensive right now.
Yeah.
But, many analysts think that for at least kind of commuter transportation and local transportation, that electric cars are the future. There are some people who think that hydrogen-powered cars with fuel cells will be the future. And so the jury's still out, but basically any kind of good low-carbon technology that can compete in the marketplace, I'm in favor of.
It's a good thing, yeah. And let's kind of, for listeners to understand, what are the major contributing factors in your eyes and what you've studied to the global warming effects? Is it the airplanes? Is there one specific category that we can look at to kind of help us identify what are the main causes of this climate change?
There are really maybe three main categories, and it's pretty pervasive through the entire economy. And so about, maybe 1/3, I'm just making very rough numbers, maybe about 1/3 of carbon dioxide emissions come from the transportation sector. So that's cars, automobiles, and airplanes, trucks, and so on. And, as much of that could be electrified as possible, if we can generate the electricity with low carbon sources, that would be great. And then about 1/3 or so comes from heating and cooling demand, just sort of keeping the temperatures of our buildings at a nice, pleasant level. And then about 1/3 has to do with industrial activities of making steel and other products that we consume on a daily basis. And so, really, and most of it is coming from burning of coal, oil, and gas. And so it's really fossil fuels and then dumping the resulting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that's the problem.
So when you, it seems like you were the lead author or principal author on this State of the Carbon Cycle report that was presented to U.S. Congress. Were there any? Was there anything productive that came of that? Were there any? Have you seen anything to help persuade? Any laws passed? Anything that the Congress together received to help make change here?
Well, as you know, for the last, much of recent history, very little legislation has gotten through Congress and has been signed by a president. Yeah. And that includes all kinds of energy policy and climate-related efforts. And under Obama, with the after the 2008-9 financial crisis, they did put money in the Department of Energy for an advanced research projects agency on energy. And then Obama couldn't get anything through legislatively, so he tried to do what he could do through executive orders and regulatory actions by agencies, but that was limited. And so, I think there's been, and then recently there's been some backsliding with President Trump pulling out of the international agreements to try to reduce our emissions, and then also trying to undermine restrictions on coal coal-fired power plants, and so I think we've been backsliding a bit recently.
What is the one of the biggest obstacles that you see in regards to? It just seems like there's still a large number of people out there, whether they're politicians that are bought out by special lobbyists or special interests. It seems like there's a large percentage of people that are just still really immune to even wanting to try to accept the concept that our planet is in danger. Are you finding that? And if you're finding that, what are some of the obstacles that you see?
I think it's more about, and I don't want to be too cynical about our elected representatives, but I think most of them, if you talk privately, will understand that the science is the science and the science is sound. But we see, again and again in our political system that politicians are afraid to say or do what might be good for the long-term welfare of the country because they're concerned about getting elected, on the next election cycle. And anything, any kind of proposing of taxes or fees or regulations tends not to go down well with much of the voting population. And, but often when the regulations are in place, people are very happy with it. I guess through the 1960s and 70s, there was a development of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. And, now, that cleaned up a lot of our streams and rivers and our air and our cities, and nobody wants to go back to the smog that used to be in New York City or Los Angeles and other cities. And it's thought that that solving the climate problem in the United States would cost maybe something like twice as much as the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So it's something that our society could do. And so I think it's just one of these things where we see it right now where Congress is trying to reduce taxes, especially on the wealthy, and anything that tries to extract more resources out of those people to provide social good doesn't seem to be very politically popular in Washington right now.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, so tell us now a little bit about when it was, what stage of your life, where you were in your life that got you interested in studying this?
I first read an article about climate change in 1979, and there was an article in the New York Times, and it was based on a scientific article that appeared a few years earlier saying that large parts of Antarctica might melt as a result of our greenhouse gas emissions. And it really seemed amazing to me that I'd always thought that, well, the world is so gigantic and humans are so comparatively small that, how could it be that human civilization is having this kind of planetary impact? And it just seemed amazing to me at the time. And at the time, I'd just graduated from an undergraduate and had been working as a computer programmer. And a few years later, I went back to graduate school to study climate science so that I could try to kind of prevent our modern civilization from damaging our climate.
Yeah.
Let me say something about an earlier question about why people believing in climate models and not believing in climate models. I in the early 1990s, I was doing a postdoc at Penn State University, and there were people running climate models for ancient times, like hundreds of millions of years ago when dinosaurs were roaming the earth. And Exxon was supporting some of this research because they wanted to know where in ancient times was the ocean likely to be upwelling with big plankton blooms that would create oil deposits. And so when it came to something that would help them find oil, they were ready to use the climate models. And at the same time, they were discounting the soundness of climate models when it came to conclusions that might indicate that you might not want to burn oil and release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So I think a lot of the skepticism about climate change is either disingenuous and self-interested, or maybe some people are in denial because they want to protect their self-interest. But when it comes to making money, the companies are willing to trust the climate models.
And in your opinion, what were some of the first signs? So you date back this New York Times article that you read in '79 to kind of being that moment that got you interested. And now you've dedicated close now to seemingly 40 years, perhaps, to researching this. What were some of the early stages, the early signs that something was that these emissions, let's say, are having an effect on our global environment? What were some of the early signs?
I was in graduate school in the second half of the 1980s, and at that time, I remember we had been doing studies, and there's natural climate variability. So the Earth naturally warms and cools on a range of timescales. And I remember ourselves and other colleagues doing calculations saying that, maybe sometime in the 1990s, the climate change signal will rise out of the sort of natural variability noise. And lo and behold, by the mid-1990s, statistical analysis showed a clear imprint of human warming, and so and human influence on the climate system. I think some of the most obvious impacts of climate change can be seen in things like mountain glaciers, but also if you look at if on the Great Lakes or other lakes, when was it ice covered and not ice covered, and if you look at plants, that when do they start blooming or growing in the spring, and all kinds of statistics show that the growing seasons are getting longer. Sea ice is melting back. Greenland is losing ice through melting. I mean, there's a huge range of observations, and really one of the questions is how important will this be to humans and to natural ecosystems? And we don't know exactly how much of things like how much, say, the intensification of hurricanes, which is predicted to occur as global warming. We don't really know for sure exactly how much of the hurricanes that hit, say, Puerto Rico or Houston, how much of that was intensified from climate change. But I think that basic idea that we can expect more intense storms in the future seems well-founded. I mean, we did a paper, one of the questions is about time scale. So that over the last century, sea level has risen, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 inches, something like that. And maybe in the rest of this century it could increase a couple of feet more, which obviously if you're in Miami and the sea level rises a few feet, that might not be the best thing. But if you go out further in the future, sea level, 2 centuries from now, say, could be rising at, more or less a foot a decade, something like 10 feet a year. 10 feet a century. And, sea level, more or less sea level rise rates on the order of an inch a year. And, if sea level is going up an inch every year, year after year, and that's expected to continue, and ultimately sea level is projected to rise something like 200 feet. Now, that's going to take thousands of years for that to happen, but it really puts a different view on things. Like, what do you do with Miami if you think that sea level's just going to keep rising and rising into the future? When things flood, do you rebuild them? Do you start trying to withdraw from the coast to higher ground? I mean, what's Miami going to do in the face of this? So, basically, Miami. I don't know what the mean sea level of Miami is, but I'm sure it's less than 200 feet.
Absolutely,
and
the whole state.
And so it's going to be deep underwater sooner or later. And are we going to start planning for phasing out major coastal cities, and how are we going to think about that? So it's really, and the other, I guess one of my concerns is in the tropics, plants are already heat stressed. And there's questions about how well will these poor tropical countries be able to grow their food. And some people have associated even some of the conflict in Syria and with climate change, and that they've been experiencing extreme droughts over the last years. Now, obviously, there's lots of other political forces at play, but maybe that having drought and having trouble growing food can only exacerbate other underlying tensions. And we've also engaged in a study on migration, and there's a lot of places that are already very hot and humid are going to get even or hotter with either dry or humid, but a lot of places that are already hot are going to get even hotter, and and the potential to have climate refugees or people who are ready to migrate. And then we've already seen in Europe and the United States the resistance to migration and refugees and so on. And so the climate can exacerbate other situations that are driven mostly by other factors, and also that if climate change occurs, basically if you're already rich and industrialized, there's a lot you can do to deal with climate change. But if you're poor and already living on the edge, climate change could be the thing that could push you over the edge. And if you're getting pushed over the edge, desperate people do desperate things. And so the potential for conflict is real.
So with the rise in the CO2, which it seems that that's a naturally occurring element, if it's an element in the environment, we're getting the ozone layer damaged, and so that's allowing the sun to protrude and have a greater effect on things like ice and melting ice. Is that right? And then as a result, our sea level is rising?
So let me address that in two different ways. One, that carbon dioxide levels did vary throughout Earth's history. And what's unusual about today is the rate at which carbon dioxide is rising. So carbon dioxide is rising about 100 times faster than it did over sort of normal natural variations in geologic time. And so if climate change were occurring 100 times slower than it is today, then it's likely that natural systems could keep adapting to it. But at these rates of change, adaptation becomes really hard. The ozone layer, the destruction of the ozone layer, it was largely a result of chlorofluorocarbons and other propellants that were used in hairsprays and things like that, and refrigerants and so on. And there was a treaty, the Montreal Protocol, that greatly limited the production of those chemicals, and their concentration has been starting to reduce in the atmosphere. So actually the ozone hole over Antarctica has been starting to heal in recent years. And so that's actually a success story. It's not a pure success, but it shows it's actually the first time in which models projected that there would be environmental harm from our emissions, and that policymakers responded by reducing those emissions. And now we're seeing the benefit of those emission reductions. And so that could potentially be a model for how we think about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, excellent. I didn't know that. That's awesome. So, but overall, it sounds like the melting of the glaciers is contributing to this rise in sea level.
Yeah, there are two things that contribute to the rise of sea level. One is thermal expansion, and just in the same way that mercury in a thermometer rises in the thermometer, so it heats up and the mercury expands, as the ocean kind of acts like a big thermometer, and as you heat the ocean, the seawater expands and sea level rises. And then in addition to that, the melting of glaciers, and that's both mountain glaciers and also the big ice sheets such as Greenland or parts of Antarctica also contribute to that sea level rise. And so this is not my field of study, but my understanding is that the sea level rise over the last decades has mostly been due to this thermal expansion of the ocean, the ocean warming up and rising as a result. But over future centuries, the main contributor is likely to be melting of glacial ice.
So in regards to the ocean, what's happening? What is ocean acidification? And how should listeners be worried about that? Or should they?
Yeah, so when we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, most of it eventually dissolves in the ocean. And when carbon dioxide reacts with seawater, it becomes carbonic acid. And in high enough concentrations, this carbonic acid can dissolve the shells and skeletons of many marine organisms. And even in lower concentrations, it can make it harder for organisms to build shells and skeletons. And some of the most vulnerable populations are things like coral reefs. So corals are particularly sensitive, and also many larval stages of organisms. So there's been work done on things like oyster larvae and mussel larvae and so on, and that their skeletons don't develop properly in more acidified conditions. And so for many types of organisms, ocean acidification is likely to be a major negative impact. It's what's less known is what it will mean for fish and other organisms that live in the open ocean, because there are a lot of microorganisms that build little microscopic shells and skeletons out of calcium carbonate, and it's unknown if those things go away. Wherever there's light and nutrients, something will grow, but will the fish and so on that we're interested in today want to eat that? And so it's basically impossible to do experiments at the scale of big ecosystems. And so far, all the experiments have been on individual organisms, and many, but not all organisms are sensitive to ocean acidification. I think it's pretty clear we're going to be losing coral reefs within a few decades. But what it means for other ecosystems is less clear.
Yeah.
Certainly a big concern, though. The one thing that's, the other thing is a bit of like the canary in the coal mine, that, coral reefs have been around basically for hundreds of millions of years. And, the idea that all of a sudden we come on the scene and have an industrial revolution, and then things that have been able to live on this planet for hundreds of millions of years suddenly can't live here anymore. That might be a wake-up call that we might want to do things differently.
Yeah, I've had on previous guest Jeremy Hance that has written for Conservation Magazine and Yale Environment 360, and he's looked into the mangrove forests and the Sundarbans. Sundarbans, excuse me. Yeah. Sundarbans. So there's lots of things for us to globally be concerned about and look into. What is in your view? What are some of the things that the average person can do? What can each and every one of us do? I'd be the first one to kind of say, hey, go out and either get an electrical car or a hybrid. Now I mentioned that to Jeff Speck, who's a lecturer at Harvard. He lectures in urban design, and he wasn't. He had an opposing side angle to the fully electric car, just because of the coal and the battery and that sort of thing. But that would be my first thing. Would be, hey, let's cut down any way that each and every one of us can do to cut down on some of these emissions from our own lifestyle, and then certainly planting trees. And if you could touch on. How we can, in your view, how we can each, the average person, how we can try to make a dent individually.
Well, I think the most important thing is to contact your elected representatives and let them know that you're concerned about the climate problem and that you're expecting them to help develop and pass the right kind of legislation, because really it's a systemic issue. If we go to that electric car scenario, which you described, that in many places, if the electricity is made by coal, then the electric car uses electricity made by coal, and in the burning of that coal, carbon dioxide is released, and it can actually release more carbon dioxide than if you just burn gasoline. But the question is, are we worried about sort of the device level emissions, or are we concerned with a societal transformation? And in my view, is at least that electric car could be part of a future zero emission economy, and that we should be sort of helping to promote the development of components of that zero emission economy. And just so, yes, maybe buying the electric car now will actually increase in the short term some emissions, but if at the same time we're putting political pressure to either tax carbon emissions from coal plants or just regulate them away, that then in the future we could have a lower emission source of electricity, and then the car will generate lower power. But when we plug something into I plug my laptop computer here into the wall, and there's some fossil fuel that's going in to light my screen.
Right.
And I don't have any control over that except through the political process. And so, I think really the most important thing we can do is be political activists on this issue. But I agree that in terms of personal action, things that promote the development of low carbon emission technologies and that avoid activities that generate lots of emissions are good to do. But really, I think it's fundamentally a systemic problem that, what I would like is when I plug my laptop into the wall, that there's a wind turbine or something else on the other side of that wire, so that I don't have to worry about the carbon emissions.
Well said. Ken, now touch on, if you will, what is geoengineering? And I know listeners want to understand the kind of the opposing angle to things like NASA experiments releasing chemicals in the environment which may have adverse effects on human populations. Does that coincide with understanding geoengineering? Can you separate the two? Can you touch on that?
Yes. I mean, first of all, let's just say what we're talking about when say by geoengineering, and there's the word's been used in different ways by different people, but mostly people are talking about the idea that we could or people could reflect sunlight away from the Earth. And basically the sun warms the Earth, and then the greenhouse gases prevent that heat from escaping back to space. And so one way to cool the Earth would be to sort of turn down the fire or reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. And the leading idea for how to do this would be to put a bunch of tiny particles high up in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere. And people basically know that this would work because big volcanoes do this. In 1991, there was a huge volcano named Mount Pinatubo, and when it erupted, it put a lot of material in the upper atmosphere, and the next year the planet cooled. And it's thought that that humans could basically mimic what the big volcanoes do and cool the planet. And obviously this is very controversial because the Earth is a very complicated system. And, anytime you interfere in a complicated system, there's a fairly high likelihood that something will go wrong. And then there's all kinds of issues of governance and public acceptance, and that, who's going to make the decision to deploy or not deploy such a system. And if somebody's turning the planetary thermostat, whose hand gets to be on the thermostat. Now, there are some people who think that, the there's ongoing experimentation of this sort or ongoing deployment of these kinds of things already. And I just think there's no evidence of that. NASA and other agencies have done some research high in the atmosphere, putting up very small quantities of particles, but I don't think there's any evidence at all that any of these experiments present any kind of health concern.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So what is the future? You're at Stanford, and I'd imagine that you're making some progress. Can you kind of give us an idea what role you play there at the Earth System Science and what Stanford overall as a university is doing for climate change?
I think that a lot of us who got into this game as from a more climate science physics point of view are shifting to thinking about energy systems. My group is transitioning more towards energy related. I think the problem has been fairly well identified, and the problem is that we're emitting too much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we need to find a way to provide people with energy without damaging the environment. And it's one thing to say in the rich United States, we don't need more energy, but if you're in the poorest parts of Africa or Asia or South America, it's hard to tell people they don't need more energy. And so how are they going to affordably get reliable power?
Yeah.
And so we've been doing a range of research. For example, we just had a study looking at open ocean floating wind turbines and concluded that you could get, on average, 3 times the energy out of floating open ocean wind turbine farms than you could get from comparable wind farms over land. And so I think I think that really it's about making clean energy cheaper, because I think it's easy. When doing good is really expensive, people find excuses not to do good. And if you could make doing good be cheap, then it's a lot easier to get people to buy into it. And so I think the most important thing we can do as research scientists now is figure out how to make clean energy as cheap as possible.
That's awesome. That's incredible about the wind turbine on out in the open ocean. An incredible concept.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, economically today, running cables out there and floating wind turbines are hard to maintain, and so it's still economically better to put them on land today. But I mean, we're also looking at questions, more on the wind direction. That that if you put one, have a big wind farm that's going to take some wind energy out, and then, how far away would you have to put the next wind farm for it to not be influenced by the upwind wind farm? And anyway, we're working on a range of things. We're also trying to understand which kind of technical innovations would be the most help to reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Amazing, Ken. Such a pleasure to have you on the program. Can you direct listeners to learning more about you, a website or a publication, a book?
Well, I'm super Googleable, and partly because my last name is so weird. So maybe if I just spelled my last name, that would help people. So my last name is Caldeira, and if you just type Ken in front of that, so that they would just find a bunch of things on me via Google, and some of it, of course, nutcases saying nasty things about me, but most of it I think is pretty good.
That probably happens anywhere. How about some parting words, a parting message for listeners, something to take away?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I've been thinking about recently is it's easy to focus on what's going wrong and what's bad and what we need to improve. And if we just think of how amazing our modern lives is, that if you think of hunter-gatherers living 10,000 years ago, that basically everything they used every day they were able to make themselves, and probably did make themselves. And here I'm talking to using a laptop computer, going over the internet, and so almost nothing I use every day did I make myself. And so we're sitting at this pinnacle of incredible technology that could be undreamed of and would have seemed magical a few centuries ago. And so when these problems are in front of us, like getting cheap energy that doesn't damage the environment, we have so much magical technology around us that we should have the confidence that we can, if we set our minds to solving problems, that we can solve them. And I think have a little more optimism and just saying, look, we're going to solve this problem. Now, what do we have to do to solve it? Because I think it's not that hard to solve. We just have to set our minds to it and do it, and get the political will to do it. And so I really think that generating the political will to actually go ahead and do it is the critical element. Because I think once we decided to go to the moon, within a decade we were on the moon.
Yeah.
And we just have to decide we're going to solve this problem, and we will.
And that's a good point. Now, and what is a good way? Are there any organizations out there that are making some solid headway politically? And is it, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a scientist and not a politician. I know there are plenty of good organizations, but I would just start off by calling your congressman or congressperson and calling your senator, and let them know you're interested in this. Let them know you're interested in this issue, and maybe ask them what you could do to help, what they think you could do to help get progress on this issue. Because we really have to push our elected representatives to do something.
Ken, thanks for your time joining Wynwood Radio. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon there in Palo Alto.
Okay, I think I will. And thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Okay, all right, bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Caldeira. He's really one of the leading guys there on climate change. We're very, very fortunate to have him on the program. Look, Dane Wigington was former guest, and what I like to do is I like to draw both sides. So we kind of just skim the surface with Ken, and enough for us to understand what's going on, how do we make a difference, how do we reverse this, okay? I mean, the bottom line from Ken's presentation or discussion with us is cheap, clean, renewable energy sources. That is what we've got to work on as a civilization. How do we do that? There's different ways of doing that, but if you want to make a change, go knock on the door of your congressman, okay? That's it. So that's basically simply put. Now, Dane's argument is reversal of that, and he's seen some adverse effects. He draws on studies, Geo-Engineering, He's got a lot of reason behind what he's saying, and to be disturbed. And now, again, climate change, whether you slice it, whether you go one angle or another angle, it's happening. It's here. It's here to stay. We've got to reverse it. And beautifully said by Ken. It took us, we came together, we put our brains together, put a man on the moon. We did that in 10 years. We can reverse this. We can reverse the rise of the sea level. And for those in Miami and the whole state of Florida, for that matter, it should be of tantamount concern. One of the reasons a transplant to Florida from California, am broadcasting this station. I produce it, I host it. I do it every Wednesday. It's to raise concern. It's to try to get people to ask questions, and whether it's a pesticide that's being sprayed that's harmful, whether it's a pesticide that's contributing to greenhouse gas, whatever it may be. or Zika or the Federal Reserve. There are a number of issues in our days that we've got to tackle. Pick your poison, grab one, go with it. Ken Caldeira joins us from Palo Alto. Google him. Read about him. As you heard, he's dedicated 40 years, well, basically since 1979, about 40 years, to trying to educate and help the masses understand climate change. So we're indebted for Ken coming on the program. I'll cut to about a 30-minute break, and I'll be back at the 5 o'clock hour, 5:15 to be exact, with current blockchain engineer Preeti Casaretti. I believe he'll be joining us from San Francisco as well. You've turned into Wynwood Radio. I'm your host for program discussions. I'll be back. Be awesome.